Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The wind in Abaddon often blew with secrets, soft, lingering things that whispered through cornfields and slid past wooden shutters like gossip on a Sunday morning. And on such a quiet evening, Clara O'Moyle stood behind the iron-gated front of her boutique, staring into the gathering dusk, her heart too full for her chest. She was not a woman of many complaints. Life had toughened her in ways that didn't show on her soft skin or her small but sturdy frame. Her mother had died when she was 13, leaving behind nothing but a singer-sewing machine and lessons no one else heard. She had learned to stitch her way through grief and pain, building Clara's Touch, her modest fashion brand, in a town where business dreams often drowned in floodwater. Yet for all her resilience, Clara had a softness she had reserved for one person alone, Kelvin Afolabi. The man had come into her life like a gentle breeze, one that cooled the heat of long market days and sang lullabies into her soul. She met him at a wedding she had sewn 5 dresses for. He had walked up with a confident smirk and a compliment about the embroidery on the bride's gown, and before the pepper soup was served, Clara had already given him her number. The days that followed were laughter-filled and glittered with late-night calls, unsent poems, and 1,000 tiny promises that painted the illusion of a forever. He told her he was between jobs, trying to find his feet after leaving his last one in Calabar due to unfair office politics. He had dreams, he said, with such sincerity that Clara didn't even blink when she began footing some of his bills. After all, what was money in the face of companionship? Clara had grown up hearing her aunties say, "A good man is worth more than gold," and maybe that's why she handed out her heart like an ATM card without a pin. Kelvin wasn't just charming. He was the sort of man who noticed when your laugh changed or when your voice was hiding tears. When Clara caught the flu last July, Kelvin traveled all the way from a cure just to drop her fresh oranges and hot pepper soup made by his mother. Or so he claimed. He always claimed things. Claimed to be on his way to an interview when she couldn't reach him. Claimed to be caught in traffic when he showed up 3 hours late. Claimed to be trying his best. And Clara, who had never been loved loudly before, took all his words like communion wafers, holy and unquestioned. She gave him parts of her no one else had touched, letting him into her home, her accounts, her long-term plans. He would lie beside her on mosquito net-covered beds and speak about opening a design agency someday, with Clara as co-founder. She believed it all, because his voice didn't tremble. His hands didn't shake. And even the devil, they say, knows how to wear white when he wants to preach. On her 32nd birthday, when he surprised her with a cake and a second-hand wristwatch, she cried, not for the gift, but for the fact that someone had remembered. Little did she know the same man who remembered her favorite fruit was also memorizing excuses to give another woman in a different city. Evenings in Abaddon were golden at times, smeared with soft light and the scent of burnt firewood from backyard kitchens. Clara would sit at her shop's backroom window, watching the shadows lengthen while waiting for Kelvin's calls. She measured time not by the clock but by the promises he made. "I'll come this weekend," he'd say, and she would count down the days, the way a bride counts down to her wedding night. And sometimes he came, bearing his tired laugh and hungry stomach. She'd feed him a gussie and pounded yam, watch him eat like he hadn't seen food in weeks, then hold him like he hadn't known peace in years. But even in those quiet nights, a part of her wondered about the parts of his life she hadn't seen. He was always mysterious about certain things. His phone never rang in her presence, his social media as empty as a dried river. Once, when she asked why he never posted photos of them, he kissed her forehead and said, "Real love doesn't need an audience." And Clara, ever the believer, smiled and let it go. Because when you love someone from a place of emptiness, every lie feels like a gift, every excuse like a reason to stay. Her best friend, Ava, once raised an eyebrow when Clara paid Kelvin's house rent a second time, but Clara laughed it off, saying, "We're building something together." What she didn't realize was that she was laying bricks alone, while Kelvin drew blueprints in another woman's heart. But perhaps the deepest cut of all was not the lies he told, but the truth he withheld. Behind every goodnight text was another goodnight whispered into someone else's ear. While Clara waited in Ilorine with folded clothes and hot stew, Kelvin was sipping wine in Calabar, laughing at jokes that had nothing to do with her. His life was divided like a jigsaw puzzle, and Clara only had the corners. He spoke in future tense, always promising what he hadn't the intention or capacity to deliver. There was a weekend he swore he had malaria, bedridden and weak, yet a friend of Ava's spotted him at a party in Acadia, dancing like he had 2 livers. When Clara confronted him, he wept like a child without sin, told her he was trying to escape the noise, and she, foolish in love, forgave him before her anger could finish boiling. Because sometimes hope is louder than reason. Clara wore her love for Kelvin like an agbada, visible, heavy, and flowing. But it was love laced with thorns. And as her belly began to swell with the first signs of pregnancy, she still thought of names. She still saw a future. She still hoped that someday he would become the man she had imagined. Not knowing, of course, that imagination had become her only companion in the relationship. There was something about the city of Calabar that made everything feel new. Maybe it was the way the rain polished the streets until they gleamed like glass, or the way strangers exchanged greetings with a kind of warmth that didn't belong to the chaos of larger cities. It was here that Haleen Kem chose to restart her life, far away from the tangled ruins of a love that had drained her spirit back in Owerri. She had come to Calabar with only 2 suitcases and a head full of cautious hope. Her cousin had found her a small apartment not far from Marion Road, and she had recently secured an internship at a digital media agency. It wasn't much, but it was honest, and for the first time in a long while, Haley felt like her life had found rhythm again. She had sworn off romance entirely, tired of the games men played and the apologies that arrived too late. She wanted peace, quiet evenings, pepper soup at roadside joints, books with pages worn from too much loving. But fate, it seemed, had a different script waiting for her. One Thursday night, at a poetry event held at a cozy lounge called The Palms, she met him. Kelvin walked in wearing a simple tee and jeans, but he had the air of someone who owned the room. His laughter cut through the background music like a familiar song, and when he took the mic and read a short poem about love lost in Lagos traffic, the crowd chuckled, including Haley. He spotted her from across the room, and when the event ended, he approached her with a knowing smile and a compliment about her smile, which she hadn't even known she wore that night. They talked casually at first, 2 strangers passing time under string lights and open skies. Haley never believed in sparks, not anymore, but Kelvin made conversation feel like music. He asked about her hometown, her favorite food, what books she liked. He didn't pry too deep, didn't talk too much about himself either, but when he did, he painted himself as a man rebuilding from ashes. I just moved here, he said, his tone low but deliberate. Needed a fresh start. Sometimes life demands a restart button. He told her he was a freelance creative consultant, mostly working remotely, and occasionally took gigs in cities like Ibadan, Ilorin, and Akure. She didn't question much at first. His stories felt normal, unremarkable even. There were no grand claims, no boastful declarations, just a quiet man with soft eyes and stories that made sense. They exchanged numbers that night. Nothing dramatic. No sparks flying. Just 2 people sharing a gentle moment at the edge of their own personal journeys. Over the following weeks, their chats became more frequent. He would send her morning texts, simple, thoughtful things like, "Hope today treats you kind." And on days when the rain wouldn't let up and her spirit dipped, he'd call just to listen to her sighs and tell her everything would be okay. When he finally invited her to dinner, he arrived with suya wrapped in foil and a short novel by Chimamanda Adichie tucked under his arm, saying, "Thought you'd like this more than flowers." Haley smiled, actually smiled, and told herself it was okay to let someone in again. Just a little. Just this once. She didn't know that she was unlocking the door for a storm to walk in wearing a poet's skin and a borrowed heart. They began to see each other more often. Kelvin never imposed, never rushed things. He played the role of the patient admirer, the kind that asks if your mother's health is better and listens when you talk about your fears. Every time Clara called during their time together, Kelvin would glance at his phone and smile sheepishly before saying, "Sorry, that's my mom. She checks in every evening." Haley never doubted him. Why would she? His tone held no trace of guilt, no nervous energy, and so she let him hold her hand in traffic. Let him whisper Yoruba proverbs into her ears, even though she didn't fully understand them. He was present but never overwhelming, like soft music in the background, something you grew used to without realizing it. Sometimes they would sit on the rooftop of her building and talk about dreams. He told her he was planning to pitch a design campaign to a major brand. She told him she wanted to one day run her own media firm. They fit together in that way 2 people often do, before reality sharpens its teeth. Haley's friends warned her to slow down. One of them, Ifioma, said, "Calm down, oh. This guy sounds too perfect." But Haley only laughed. Not because she didn't believe Ifioma, but because it felt good to believe in something again. She had spent so long waiting for the other shoe to drop that she convinced herself maybe this time there were no shoes at all. Maybe this was it. Maybe she had finally found someone who didn't carry chaos in his back pocket. But as the days slipped into weeks, small cracks began to form, barely noticeable things at first, like echoes behind closed doors. Kelvin rarely let her hold his phone, always placing its screen down when they were together. He never stayed the night, always claiming early morning calls or meetings in another city. Once, when she playfully asked for his Instagram handle, he said, I'm not really on social media like that. Too much noise." Haley didn't push. She had learned from past scars that pressing too hard made men run, so she smiled and nodded. Still, the feeling lingered, an itch at the back of her mind she couldn't quite scratch. Then there was the way he'd go silent for hours without explanation. She told herself it was work. Freelancers had unpredictable schedules, after all. But there was a night he was meant to come over and never did. No call, no text, just silence. The next morning, he apologized with a voice so sincere she almost cried. He claimed his phone died during an impromptu client meeting, and by the time he returned home, he was too exhausted to explain. She forgave him. Not because the excuse made sense, but because the apology reminded her of every moment she felt seen by him. And in a world where men vanished without a trace, at least Kelvin showed up the next day with a reason. The part of her that still feared abandonment clung to that. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that every moment she thought was theirs alone was being rehearsed, repeated, recycled. The Kelvin she loved was a portrait painted with borrowed colors. And slowly, very slowly, the canvas was beginning to peel. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace. It sits heavily in the room, pressing against the walls, hovering like a ghost that refuses to leave. That silence filled Clara's apartment the morning she held the pregnancy test in her hands. The two red lines stared back at her with a kind of defiance, not caring whether she smiled or screamed. For a long moment, she did neither. She simply sat on the edge of her bed, staring into space, the test strip clutched loosely in her right hand, her left hand pressed gently over her abdomen. Life, in its unpredictable cruelty, had chosen this moment to sow something fragile inside her, something that required stability, love, and truth. Yet, all Clara had was a heart filled with questions and a man who'd become increasingly distant. She hadn't seen Kelvin in over 2 weeks. The last time he visited, he claimed he had been working on a brand design campaign in Port Harcourt. She had cooked okra soup that night, poured cold water into a jug, and laid out a clean towel on the bed. He ate quietly, said little, and left early the next morning before the sun could stretch its fingers across the city. At the time, Clara had chalked it up to fatigue. Now, as she stared at the test result, she began to feel that old voice inside her whispering things she didn't want to hear. She tried calling him. No answer. She sent a message. No reply. She sat there for hours, until the walls felt like they were closing in. When night came, and the city's chorus of generators and laughter swelled outside, Clara laid in bed with her hands still on her belly, wondering if she was supposed to feel joy or dread. The next evening she tried again. This time Kelvin answered. His voice was soft, muffled, almost distracted. "I'm at my mum's place in a cure," he said. "She's been a bit down, and I didn't want to worry you. You know how she gets." Clara didn't ask questions. She just nodded, even though he couldn't see her, and said, "Okay, call me when you can." But the silence that followed the call was louder than before. She didn't eat that night. Instead, she sat at her sewing table, pretending to work on a new order. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment, every word, every glance Kelvin had given her over the last few months. Something didn't add up. There were times he would vanish for days and come back with a story that sounded like it had been rehearsed. Once, he claimed he had malaria but posted a photo of grilled fish at a restaurant in Enugu 2 days later. He said it was an old photo when she asked. She believed him because it hurt less to believe than to face the possibility that he had another life. But now, with the child growing inside her and the distance between them thickening, she couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Still, Clara didn't confront him. She wasn't ready for answers she couldn't return. What she needed was proof, not suspicion. And so she waited, hoping that whatever truth hid behind his silence would eventually crawl out on its own. On a Friday night that carried the kind of stillness only harmattan winds can deliver, the truth came knocking, not loudly, not with a bang, but quietly like a mistake. Clara was in her living room, dozing lightly to the muted sounds of a movie when her phone vibrated on the couch beside her. She picked it up without checking the screen and answered, expecting Ava or a client calling late. But what greeted her was not a voice, it was a breath. Soft at first, then deep, uneven, laced with the unmistakable rhythm of intimacy. Her brows furrowed. "Hello," she whispered. No reply. Just more sound. Then came a giggle, feminine, airy. Followed by Kelvin's voice, low and slow, murmuring sweet, familiar words he had once used on her. Clara sat upright, her heart hammering like thunder behind her ribs. She didn't speak again. She simply listened, each second unraveling what remained of her innocence. The call lasted exactly 3 minutes and 24 seconds, and when it ended, Clara didn't move. Her body was stiff, her lips slightly parted as though her soul had stepped out of her. She felt violated, not just by the sounds of betrayal, but by the realization that while she had been carrying his child, Kelvin had been giving his loyalty to someone else. Her vision blurred, but not from tears. She didn't cry. Not that night. Something colder than grief settled into her, something steel-hard, unforgiving. She turned off her phone, laid back on the couch, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the wind picked up, blowing dust against her windows. Inside, Clara whispered a single sentence under her breath. "He doesn't deserve this child." The words weren't angry. They were calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes before a storm with no name. She didn't go to work the next day. Instead, she took a cab to a private clinic near Ring Road and asked to speak to a doctor. She sat through the process quietly, answered questions, nodded when she was told about the risks, and signed the necessary forms. The nurse looked at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity, but Clara didn't flinch. Her face held no cracks, her eyes no tears. The procedure was scheduled for Monday morning. That weekend, she kept to herself, turned off her phone, and stayed wrapped in silence, as though shielding the last pieces of herself from shattering completely. When Monday came, she walked into the clinic alone. She refused to hold anyone's hand or look anyone in the eye. She lay on the operating table like someone ready to forget, and when it was over, she emerged into the daylight feeling both emptier and lighter. The irony did not escape her, that she had come in carrying life and left with silence. She went home, showered, and resumed work the next day like nothing had happened. When Ava visited that evening, Clara smiled. She cooked. She laughed at a joke she'd barely heard. When Kelvin finally called 2 days later, asking where she'd been, she told him she'd been tired and had a minor flu. He apologized for not checking in more often. Said he had been under pressure. Clara told him it was okay. Her voice was soft, her tone unchanged. Because now she knew. The game had changed. And Clara, the same woman who once loved with both eyes closed, was wide awake. There's something about betrayal that changes the way a person breathes. It doesn't shout. It settles into the lungs slowly like dust. You begin to breathe through it, around it, with it, until one day, you realize that everything you inhale feels heavier than it should. That was the reality Clara now lived in. The apartment she once considered a nest now felt like a waiting room, where she watched the minutes tick away, knowing the man on the other end of her heart wasn't who he claimed to be. But she didn't burn bridges. She didn't ask questions. She didn't storm his doorstep like women in movies. Instead, she let the silence grow roots. She waited for Kelvin to speak himself into a corner. And every time he called her, every time he laughed like nothing had changed, she recorded pieces of his words in her mind. She began to memorize his rhythm, not as a lover, but like a writer studying a character in a play. She became deliberate, listening for inconsistency, measuring the pauses between his lies, taking note of every time he said he loved her. That word, which once wrapped around her like a blanket, now felt like a threadbare sheet on a rainy night. It didn't cover anything. She stopped praying for his attention. She stopped hoping he'd change. She stopped imagining futures with him. What she wanted now wasn't revenge. It was truth. Cold, naked truth. And so she did the unthinkable. She asked Ava to help her create a fake TikTok account, complete with a few borrowed photos and an aesthetic she'd never use. "Why TikTok?" Ava asked. "Because that's where people reveal who they really are," Clara replied. It was a wild idea, and it felt ridiculous at first. But Clara had learned that men like Kelvin were usually faithful to one thing: attention. And TikTok was the perfect stage. Meanwhile, across the quiet stretch of Calabar, Haley was glowing. Not just the kind of glow that comes from good food and clean sleep, but the dangerous kind. The kind that blooms when someone gives you just enough love to believe in them, even if your gut tells you to slow down. Her relationship with Kelvin had grown deeper. He had started calling her my peace, and the words felt like balm against old wounds. He began referring to her as someone special, someone he could build with. He brought her shawarma on Thursdays and sent her voice notes reciting love poems in Yoruba on Sunday evenings. She didn't always understand the words, but the sound of them made her blush. Kelvin had a way of entering your life like sunlight through sheer curtains, soft, steady, and warm enough to make you forget that heat can burn. One night, while watching TikTok videos together, Haley turned to him and asked, "What would you do if someone posted you without asking?" He chuckled and said, "I don't really like attention. Let's keep what we have sacred, I beg." She nodded. She wanted to respect his wishes, even though something inside her wanted to scream her joy into the digital sky. Instead, she posted a silhouette of their hands touching across a table, captioned simply, "Softness I didn't know I needed." That post reached over 20,000 views in 2 days. Clara saw it, not on her own feed, but on the burner account Ava had created. And she watched that video at least 10 times, not out of heartbreak, but out of confirmation. The hand in the silhouette wore the same wristwatch Kelvin had once told Clara he inherited from his late uncle. That same night, she received a "goodnight baby" text from him. Her lips twitched, not into a smile, but into a shape that no longer trusted language. Clara's silence wasn't passive anymore. It was calculated. She played the part of the girlfriend perfectly, still texting him when expected, still asking about his work trips, still sending small airtime gifts when he claimed his data was low. And Kelvin? He lapped it all up. Men like him often mistaken silence for submission, not realizing they are dining on their own undoing. Clara was learning how to listen in new ways. Every lie he told became another thread in the noose he didn't know he was wearing. But she wasn't rushing. She had seen what happened to women who went after justice with fury. The world called them bitter, broken, dramatic. Clara didn't want noise. She wanted clarity. And so, one Friday evening, while Kelvin claimed to be in Abuja for a client pitch, Clara followed a tip from Ava and tracked down a TikTok live Haley had joined. The page didn't show Kelvin's face at first. Just his voice in the background, laughing, teasing someone about being wife material. The camera eventually turned, and there he was, wearing the shirt Clara had bought him 2 months ago for his interview. He was relaxed, unbothered, basking in the attention. The host of the live teased him, asking why a fine man like him was still single. He leaned into the camera and said, "I'm just waiting for the right one. Still searching. Real women no day again." And just like that, Clara saw not just the death of their relationship, but the burial of every lie he had told. She didn't comment. Not yet. She wanted the right moment. The perfect storm. And as she logged off, her fingers hovered over her keyboard. "Let him finish digging," she whispered. What Haley didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that her phone had become a stage, and her audience included the very woman Kelvin had buried under layers of deceit. That weekend, Kelvin visited her again. He brought food from her favorite restaurant, said he missed her, kissed her forehead like a saint. They watched movies together. He made jokes about other couples who had no loyalty. Haley laughed, held his hand, and believed him. He even offered to help her with a campaign she was managing at work, saying he had ideas on how to make it go viral. Haley, ever trusting, handed him her laptop. And while he worked beside her, she took a video, one she planned to post later. It was a quiet moment, just the side of his face, his hands typing. She added music and a caption that read, "Some people are too good to be real." That video would eventually reach Clara through the burner account. And this time, she didn't watch it 10 times. She downloaded it, saved it, archived it. The folder on her phone titled Truth was growing daily. And while Kelvin continued to feed both women the same sweet poison in different cups, the storm he didn't see coming was learning how to hold a camera. Evening in Ilorin arrived with that familiar blend of fading sunlight and unanswered questions. Clara had grown used to this kind of quiet, a quiet that didn't soothe but unsettled, like the calm that lingers before rainfall. She was no longer waiting for closure. She was gathering it piece by piece, like stones from a riverbed, each smoother than the last. She had learned to observe rather than react, and lately, she'd become fluent in the language of pretense. Kelvin still called, still sent messages wrapped in charm, still used pet names like they meant anything, and Clara played her part like a seasoned actress in a tragic play. She responded with just enough warmth to keep him comfortable, never more, never less. Ava would sometimes glance at her in disbelief and say, "You're a better woman than I am," to which Clara would only smile without answering. There was no virtue in what she was doing. No nobility. It was simply strategy. The wounds he caused had healed over with purpose, not pity. On this particular Sunday, her instincts told her to stay close to her phone. She had grown accustomed to the pattern of Kelvin's deception, and something about the silence in the air made her certain that tonight would be different. She lay on her sofa, scrolling casually through her burner TikTok account, when a familiar name flashed across her screen at Kelvin Wade. Live now. She clicked without hesitation, and what opened was not just a video, but a performance. He was sitting on a couch, bathed in LED lights, wearing the same navy blue shirt she had bought him for his brand pitch interview weeks ago. His smile was broad, confident, and artificial. The caption read, "Single. Searching. No drama." The irony cut through her chest like glass. The feed was alive with laughter and flirty comments from strangers who saw only the version of him he wanted them to see. People were asking questions. "Are you really single? Where's your dream girl hiding?" And Kelvin answered with a smug grin, "I'm single, no attachments. Just looking for someone real." Clara blinked. Not in surprise, but in certainty. This was the moment. She had prepared herself for this. Months of silence, of collecting proof, of listening to her intuition, it all led here. Her fingers moved with calm precision as she typed her message into the comment box. No anger. No expletives. Just a few lines of simple truth. "I'm Clara. We were together for 2 years. I carried his child. He cheated. I had to end the pregnancy alone. Ask him." She hit send, and then everything changed. The feed slowed, the comment section exploded. "Who's Clara? Wait, this guy get babe? Omo, this live just turned film." Kelvin's smile faltered, just slightly, but it was enough. The shift in his energy was immediate. He tried to recover with a chuckle, muttering, "Some people just type rubbish for clout." But his voice lacked the composure it usually held. Clara didn't comment again. She didn't need to. The words were there, frozen in the feed, replayed in real time by everyone watching. And just when it seemed like things couldn't spiral further, another notification popped up. Haley had joined the live. Her face appeared on the split screen, her background dimly lit, brows drawn tight with restrained fury. She looked directly into the camera and spoke, her voice slow and steady, like someone piecing together clarity as she spoke it aloud. "Kelvin, please tell them who I am," she said. Her voice was free of theatrics. She didn't shout, didn't curse. That would have been too easy. She simply let the words fall like weights. The silence on Kelvin's end was thick enough to choke on. He blinked several times, as though trying to remember who he was in that moment. "Haley, listen, it's not what you think," he started, but even he didn't believe his own sentence. "You told me you were single," Haley continued, her voice cracking only slightly. "You said you wanted to build something with me. I gave you my time, my heart. What exactly were you trying to build? A harem?" The comments section had become a storm. Viewers were screen recording, reposting, tagging gossip blogs. Some laughed. Some gasped. Others typed paragraphs demanding explanations. And Kelvin sat frozen in the digital courtroom he had unknowingly walked into, being judged not just by 2 women, but by everyone who had ever fallen for a sweet-talking fraud. Haley disconnected. Clara did too. But the damage was already viral. Within minutes, snippets of the live were flooding TikTok and Twitter. People duetted the clip with reactions. A local podcast reposted it with the caption, "Mr. Romantic has been exposed." 2 women. 1 lie. The fire was burning, and for the first time, Kelvin was standing in the center with nowhere to run. By nightfall, his name was no longer just a name. It had become a cautionary term. "Don't pull a Kelvin," one user tweeted. "If he says he's single, check with the other 3 women in his life." His social media was flooded. DMs filled with backlash, some threats, some mockery. Friends began to unfollow quietly. Even his job was at risk. His design clients started pulling contracts. One brand rep messaged, "With the kind of publicity you're attracting, we can't associate with you. This isn't personal. It's business." And it was. Kelvin had built his entire identity on curated perception, and now that image was leaking from every corner. He tried reaching out to Clara, calls, texts, even a long voice note that began with "Please, just hear me out." But Clara never replied. She had nothing more to say. She had already said it. once, publicly, and with the kind of finality that echoed louder than any apology. Kelvin called Haley too. She picked once, listened silently as he tried to explain, then said just 5 words. "You broke the wrong women," and ended the call. That was the last time she answered. The digital world kept spinning, new scandals rising by the day, and eventually the attention moved on. But the reputation? That stayed. It clung to Kelvin's name like a stain no rebranding could wash out. And as he sat alone in his apartment, phone face down, curtains drawn, a strange kind of silence wrapped around him. Not the type that comes before a lie. The kind that follows when you've been caught. In the days that followed the TikTok live, the air around Kelvin seemed to thicken with judgment. Even silence, once his greatest tool, became a prison. He tried to tell his side of the story in voice notes sent to a few mutual friends, laced with half-formed excuses and voice cracks meant to mimic remorse. But the damage had already shaped itself into something irreversible. The video was everywhere now, on the phones of strangers, in office group chats, on church youth WhatsApp statuses. People who barely knew his name now knew his face, and they didn't see charm anymore. They saw a cautionary tale wearing cologne. The same men who used to laugh at his jokes at the barbershop now nodded slowly when his name was mentioned, followed by the same 4 words. He did it to himself. The women gave colder reactions. Some didn't even speak when they passed him on the street. They simply raised their brows or gave him the kind of glance that says, "We know what you are." His landlord asked him quietly to consider moving out. "You know, say my wife day here too," the man said with a polite frown. Kelvin said nothing, just nodded and walked back to his flat where the curtains remained closed and the air tasted of shame. His phone rang less. The messages stopped. The world moved on from him at a speed he didn't expect. He would later tell himself he was only trying to find happiness, trying to be loved in multiple ways, but deep down he knew. He had used 2 women like placeholders for the version of himself he wished existed, then lost both, along with the mirror that had kept him believing he was a good man. Clara, on the other hand, didn't celebrate the fall. She didn't post follow-up videos or grant interviews like many had suggested. Even when Ava pushed her to speak her truth more publicly, she declined with a tired smile. Clara wasn't interested in likes or shares, or the kind of validation that came from digital applause. She had already done the hardest thing. She had walked away with her dignity intact. The pain hadn't left. Some nights, she still woke with her hand across her abdomen, wondering what the child might have looked like, whether they would have had Kelvin's smile or her eyes. But the ache had evolved into something quiet, not gone but bearable. She poured her energy back into her boutique, reorganized her shelves, updated her inventory, and started taking orders from new clients in Port Harcourt. The business became her therapy, the fabric her prayer mat. Sometimes, when she stitched late into the night, she thought about how much she had given of herself to a man who had treated her love like a backup plan. But then the needle would glide through silk, smooth and obedient, and she would remind herself that she had survived. Not just the heartbreak, but the erasure. Kelvin had tried to delete her with dishonesty, reduce her to a name he could deny on a live stream, but she had redefined herself. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. She was no longer the woman waiting for closure. She was the one who gave it to herself. And in that quiet victory, she found a kind of peace that didn't shout, but lasted. Haley's healing didn't happen all at once. It crept in slowly, like sunlight through heavy curtains, subtle and unannounced. When she arrived in Owerri, her mother met her at the bus terminal with arms that said nothing and everything at once. They didn't speak about Kelvin that first night. They just sat on the veranda sipping tea, watching the street lamps flicker while dogs barked at ghosts they couldn't see. The next morning, Haley opened her phone, deleted the TikTok app, and removed every trace of Kelvin from her gallery. Not out of anger, but necessity. She needed to feel new again. Not untouched, but whole in spite of the touch. Her days became filled with long walks, cooking with her younger cousins, and reading novels she had left unfinished. Slowly, the heavy thoughts became less frequent. She still thought about the version of herself who had believed every sweet word Kelvin whispered, but she didn't hate that girl. She had loved purely. She had trusted without suspicion. And now she had learned. When she returned to Calabar 2 weeks later, her world looked different. She didn't laugh as quickly or trust as easily, but she had grown a spine where there used to be softness. At work, she took on a new campaign and poured herself into the process. She smiled more often, but not always. She replied to texts slower. But she felt grounded, less likely to float into fantasies crafted by smooth voices and perfect teeth. Haley didn't become bitter. She became wiser. And there's a difference the world rarely celebrates, but should. Life continued in quiet revolutions for everyone involved. Kelvin stayed in Ilorine a little while longer before disappearing from most people's radar. Some said he moved to Lagos to start afresh, though no one cared enough to confirm. His name faded like old graffiti, once loud, now barely legible. Clara's business expanded to a second shopfront. She hired 2 apprentices, both young girls who reminded her of her own beginnings. On weekends, she visited her aunt's grave, sometimes speaking aloud about things only she and the wind would understand. She never dated again, not yet. But she smiled more now, and when asked about love, she would say, "I haven't ruled it out. I'm just not auditioning anymore." Haley, meanwhile, took a solo trip to Jos later that year. She climbed rocks, took photographs, and wrote short essays about healing she never posted online. Her life became a gentle rebellion against the parts of her that once allowed too much, too quickly. The world didn't crown either woman a heroine. There were no grand finales. Just 2 women who walked through fire, learned its language, and stepped out with stories etched beneath their skin. They never became friends, but they never became enemies either. They existed like parallel lines, once touched by the same man, now moving forward in different directions, never crossing again. And that was enough. Not all wounds become wisdom immediately. Some take time, some take silence. But eventually the scars stop aching, and all that's left is a reminder, you survived. Dear listener, no matter how deeply you love, never forget to love yourself first. Don't ignore the signs just because the heart wants to hope. If someone treats your loyalty like an option, know this, you were never the problem. Protect your peace, protect your worth, and never beg for the bare minimum. Love is beautiful, yes, but only when it's honest, whole, and returned. You are not hard to love. You were just giving your softness to someone who didn't know how to hold it. May your heart never fall into the hands of someone who doesn't know its value. May your love be returned in full, not in pieces. May you never be misled by a sweet mouth with sour intentions. May God remove the wrong people before they reach the sacred parts of your life. May peace wrap around you like morning light, and may your next chapter be filled with truth, ease, and joy that doesn't come with confusion. May you heal loudly, rise boldly, and love again, fearlessly. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.